Georgina Montgomery. I'm an associate professor in Lyman Briggs and the History Department and Director of Science and Society at State, or S3, here at MSU. I think of it in kind of four ways. So one of them is the diversity of sources that I expose my students to, so the kind of information that they're reading and absorbing. I also think of it in terms of the diversity of disciplines, so I have different disciplinary perspectives represented in my classroom. I also think about voice. I'm a historian of science. I'm always interested in whose voices are being heard and whose are being silenced, so I try and have diverse voices as perspectives. And then finally, but by definitely not least, the diversity and inclusion in the classroom. I think it's really important that any STEM student sees themselves in their class. So that might be pictures that they can relate to of scientists who look like them in textbooks. It might be course content of particular interest to them or an aspect of their demographic group. And also in terms of future professionals, if these STEM majors, for example, are going into STEM or health professionals, how can they be really effective professionals and really effective citizens? And I think being able to situate the science in its social cultural context, both historically and today, is a really important part of that. So one of the examples that comes to mind is I have this class called Technology and Culture, and I taught that for the first time last year, and I had a unit on Alan Turing and Imitation Game. That was a time when the Imitation Game was in movie theaters around the country and winning quite a lot of awards and getting quite a lot of media buzz. So I used that as an opportunity to assign different perspectives and different types of sources. So we read history of science sources, we read Alan Turing's own work as well, so STEM publications. And then we also did a class field trip to the cinema, which gave a sort of more popular account of the history. So that was an example of different sources being used and also different disciplines being used. But also the content connects with diversity in science because it was a way to talk about LGBTQ scientists and really that kind of invisibility that's often felt by LGBTQ scientists. And we looked at that today. So we started off in World War II and sort of ended up in the contemporary period. And I had my students basically design a sort of policy for their laboratory. So imagining once they've graduated and if they have their own lab or they're running their own lab, how are they going to create an inclusive environment? So they actually came up with policies for that and read some online blogs that talking about the impact of rainbow stickers, for example, in laboratories. And they talked about how some of their own labs here on campus had rainbow stickers and some that didn't, and talking about that with their STEM professors, but also thinking about how can we continue to do better as a future generation, how can they do better to create more inclusion. So the content was to do with diversity in science, and then also diverse disciplines and diverse sources were used in that example. Another example is the history of parenting, so that's a more medicine-based example, but I look at the early 20th century when most doctors would advise mothers not to overly give too much affection, so not to hold or kiss your child too much because of fear of disease, so part of the hygiene movement, but also fear that you might make your child homosexual, which was seen as an illness during that time period or a sickness that would require treatment. And this sort of medical paradigm translated also to hospitals. So if you had a child in a hospital setting, you as a parent would be advised not to hold your child for perhaps weeks or months on end. So we read things from doctors, we read mothers' responses to this medical advice, some of them pushing against that medical advice and using their own common sense and intuitions to challenge it. But then I also am conscious when I do the history of parenting that one voice that isn't heard is the children's themselves voices. So I show a black and white documentary called Peril in Infancy from 1947. And it's less of a documentary, more of it was to be shown at medical professional societies to try and convince doctors about the problems of this approach and how it could be done better. And it shows some babies in a hospital and also in an orphanage, associated with a prison, so if women were in prison, their children were there. And at the beginning, they're happy, healthy, young individuals, and after 2 or 3 months of not being held, they're rocking back and forth, sort of catatonic in these cribs. And I use that as a chance to sort of bring home the idea that history and these episodes were lived by people. And whenever I watch that black and white film, I cry and tear up, and I tell them it's going to be emotional, and they feel that empathy too. So I think that's important in terms of incorporating voices, thinking who has a voice and who doesn't, who's silenced and who isn't. But also I think it's important to bring empathy and emotion into the classroom. And I think that's particularly important for STEM and health professionals, to realize what was done to people in the past, and perhaps in some situations what continues to be done to certain groups, and to have empathy and understanding for that. Well, another way I think about diversity in the classroom and sources is giving over some class time to the students. I like to think that in any classroom you have 20, 30 or 100 or however many unique perspectives in the room, and I've increasingly come to think of my classes as a product of my own interest and my own things that I'm drawn to. So part of my reading of feminist pedagogy is trying to think about ways to empower the students to contribute to the material. So I have a lot of the content mapped out, but I have about 4 or 5 different times from the semester when I do team choice presentations, when I let student teams present on something that's connected to the course topic, but not covered in the syllabus so far or to date in that semester. They get to bring their own content. So they do a research lecture, 20-minute lecture, they choose a reading for in class, and then they lead discussion. And it's just a way to sort of get that diversity of perspectives into the room and not make it all about me and my interest. I think that's easier to do in smaller classes, but even in larger classes, you could have students vote on content. For example, if there's 2 or 3 different things and there's different books or sources that could be used for that, the students can take part in shaping the curriculum in that way. I think one of the main ways I leverage diversity in the classroom is using CAPME to form diverse student teams that run the whole course of the semester. And CAPME isn't perfect, but it does really help you form diverse teams. And one of the things I really try to do is have different ages of students in teams. And I've seen a lot of informal mentoring happening, especially if you have sort of sophomore with seniors and so forth helping each other out. And CAPME allows you to ask questions about gender, race, ethnicity, GPA, and major. So these are some of the things that we can use to make diverse teams. I've also been very conscious, though, of the invisibility of certain types of diversity in the room, and it's not like you can just look around your classroom and see, oh, this is how it is, or it's not diverse. So I've really tried to be conscious of that. One of the things I've started doing is a privilege walk activity, which I think is a high risk but also high reward activity when you talk about privilege. And that's something that has to be done in a confidential way, and I do it with my students, but it has enabled us to be more conscious of the different types of diversity in the room. But I think really what's important is creating an inclusive class environment. There's so many types of diversity you can't see. Sexual orientation, class background, are they a first generation student whose parents didn't go to college? We don't know those things about our students most of the time. So I think really it's about creating an inclusive classroom where everybody in the room feels comfortable to give their perspective when talking about class material. So Science and Society at State is seeking to bring more connections between the humanities and social sciences and STEM and health professionals. And that's in the research setting, in the grant setting, but also in the education setting. One of the main things that science studies scholars, so people who use humanities and social science to study science, do is to show that science is a human endeavor. It is a social enterprise. It's done by humans in a certain political, cultural context. And when students can see that, they can see themselves more as scientists practicing science. If often students think science is done all alone with like just a genius in the room that's coming up with these great ideas, and that simply is not the case. It wasn't the case for even someone like Darwin, who's often thought as a genius. He had hundreds of people sending him data. He was corresponding to hundreds of people, bouncing ideas off people. When students can see that science is done in a collaborative way, in a team setting, it's not just one person. When they can see that it's not all lone white males doing these things, they can identify more with STEM. So I see S3 really connected with STEM education in that way, and also really bringing an interdisciplinary perspective to STEM education, which more and more is what people are calling for to sort of solve contemporary wicked problems. We need that interdisciplinary perspective.